He walked away from her without a single look back. Roman DeLuca, the most feared name in Chicago's criminal underworld, signed the divorce papers, erased Elena Cross from every record he controlled, and buried whatever he once felt beneath concrete and gunmetal. He told himself she had betrayed him. He told himself she deserved everything that came after. For 6 years, he believed both lies completely. Then 3 children stepped in front of his convoy on a rain-soaked street in downtown Chicago, and the man who had ordered 100 men to their deaths couldn't move a single inch forward. If you've been waiting for a story about what it truly costs a man to destroy the people who love him, stay until the very end. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's begin. The convoy moved through the financial district at 7:14 in the evening, 3 black Escalades cutting through the post-rush traffic with the quiet authority of vehicles that expected everything else to get out of the way. It was the kind of movement Roman DeLuca had perfected over 15 years. Unhurried, controlled, inevitable. The kind of movement that said, "We are not afraid of what's waiting at the other end of this road." Roman sat in the middle vehicle, second row, left side. He had chosen that position every single day for over a decade, close enough to the driver to redirect the route if needed, close enough to the right door to exit into cover, far enough from any window that a clean shot from street level was impractical. These were not habits. They were survival mathematics, calculated so many times they had become muscle memory. He had his phone open, scrolling through acquisition figures for a warehouse property near the South Side waterfront. Numbers, percentages, square footage. The kind of transaction that looked entirely clean on paper and hid 3 layers of ugliness underneath. He didn't look up when the convoy slowed. He didn't look up when it stopped. Convoys stopped. Traffic lights. Delivery trucks blocking intersections. This was Chicago. Then his driver, Marco, said, "Boss?" 1 word. But Marco had been driving Roman for 9 years, and in 9 years, Marco had never used that tone, that flat, uncertain, almost afraid tone for a traffic light or a delivery truck. Roman looked up. 3 children stood in the middle of Walker Drive. They were perhaps 7 years old, all of them, and even from inside the tinted windows of the Escalade, in the gray-yellow wash of streetlights and headlights, the symmetry between them was unmistakable. Triplets. 2 girls, 1 boy. All 3 dressed in clothes that were clean but plain, dark jeans, simple jackets against the October chill. All 3 standing shoulder to shoulder with the absolute stillness of children who had decided something and were not going to be moved by anything short of being physically carried. The boy was in the center. He had dark hair, cut short, and he was looking directly at the windshield of Roman's Escalade with an expression that no 7-year-old should have owned. Patient, certain, unflinching. "What the hell?" Marco said quietly. Roman's security detail, 4 men in the lead vehicle, 3 in the rear, had already begun to react. The lead Escalade had stopped 5 feet from the children, and Roman could see, through the windshield, his head of security, Vincent Caruso, opening his door and stepping out, one hand raised in a placating gesture, the other hovering near his hip. "I'll handle it," Vincent's voice came over the radio, calm and professional. "Probably lost. Will—" The boy in the center spoke. Roman couldn't hear the words through the glass and the ambient noise of the city, but he saw Vincent stop moving. He saw the hand hovering near Vincent's hip drop completely. He saw Vincent, a man who had been in the room when Roman had executed 2 of his own captains for treason, take a single step backward, as though something physical had hit him. Roman opened his door and stepped out. The October air came off the Chicago River 2 blocks away, carrying that particular smell. Cold water and diesel and the metallic undertaste of a city built on greed and weather. Roman stood in the open door of his vehicle and looked at the 3 children standing in his headlights, and the boy in the center turned from Vincent and looked at him instead. "You're Roman DeLuca," the boy said. Not a question. Roman walked forward. Vincent moved to intercept, and Roman put one hand on his chest without looking at him, stopping him flat. He kept walking until he was 10 feet from the children, close enough to see them clearly in the headlights, close enough to see that the boy's eyes, dark, direct, structured around a particular bone beneath the brow, were a specific configuration that Roman had seen exactly once before. Every morning. In every mirror he had ever stood in front of. His throat did something he hadn't felt it do in a long time. It tightened. "Who are you?" he said. His voice came out even. He was grateful for that. The boy said, "Our mother said you owe us the truth." One of the girls, the one on the right, slightly taller, with a quality of watchfulness that seemed too old for her face, said, "She said you'd recognize us." The second girl on the left said nothing. She was looking at him the way a person looks at something they have studied in photographs and are now finally seen in 3 dimensions, with a strange, dispassionate recognition, almost clinical. It was more unnerving than anything the other 2 had said. "What's your mother's name?" Roman said. The boy said, "Elena Cross." Roman DeLuca had stood in rooms where men pointed guns at him. He had sat across tables from people who intended to kill him before the meeting was over. He had received phone calls informing him of events that could have unraveled everything he had built. In all of those moments, he had found that the body's actual response to genuine shock was nothing like the movies suggested. There was no dramatic flinch, no sharp intake of breath. What actually happened was quieter and more disturbing. The world simply went very still, and the mind refused for one full second to process what it had just received. That second stretched out now, on Wacker Drive, with 3 children looking at him and car horns beginning to sound from the backed-up traffic behind his convoy. Then his mind came back online, and the first thing it delivered was not grief or guilt or warmth. It was the trained calculation of a man who had survived 15 years at the top of the most dangerous criminal organization in the Midwest. His eyes moved immediately to the surrounding environment: rooftops, the mouths of alleys, parked vehicles, pedestrians who had stopped to watch. Because if Elena Cross had resurfaced after 6 years, and if these children were what they appeared to be, then someone else already knew. And if someone else already knew, then the children standing in the middle of Wacker Drive were not just children, they were a target. "Vincent," Roman said without turning around. "All 3 of them, in the vehicle. Now. Move the convoy." Vincent said, "Boss, protocol says—" "I know what protocol says." Roman finally looked back at him. "Move." The children did not resist. They came with a composure that said they had expected this outcome, had perhaps planned for it, and Roman felt something cold move through him at the recognition that 3 7-year-olds had walked into his convoy with a clear tactical objective and executed it without hesitation. He wondered where they'd learned that. He already suspected the answer. The convoy rerouted to a location that wasn't on any schedule, a private floor in a building Roman held through 4 layers of shell companies, used for meetings that didn't exist on paper. His security team swept it as a matter of routine before Roman brought the children inside. The 3 of them sat together on a leather couch and looked around the room with the careful attention of people cataloging exits and details, and Roman stood across from them and tried to organize the inside of his chest into something that functioned. "Where is she?" he said. The boy, Roman had not yet asked their names and wasn't sure he was ready to, said, "She told us not to say until we talked to you first. She sent you alone. She said you wouldn't hurt us." A pause. "She said she wasn't completely sure you wouldn't hurt her." The sentence landed without any drama, delivered in the flat, factual tone of a child reporting information rather than making an accusation. It was worse for that. Roman turned away and walked to the window and looked out at the city and tried to remember who he had been 6 years ago and what had felt true at the time. What had felt true? Elena had passed information about a shipment to a rival family. The evidence had been concrete: documentation, witnesses, a level of corroboration that had seemed impossible to fabricate. What Roman had done with that evidence was divorce her within 36 hours, strip her name from every asset, and make it comprehensively clear that she no longer existed within his world. He had not hurt her. That was the line he had told himself he had held. He had not hurt her. He had simply unmade her, and she had been pregnant, carrying triplets. And she had told no one, apparently, because telling anyone in Roman's world that she was carrying his heirs would have made her either a bargaining chip or a liability, and Elena Cross had always been smart enough to understand which categories she fell into. "How old are you?" he said, still looking at the window. 7, the boy said. "In December." The math was immediate and merciless. Roman turned back around. He looked at the three children on the couch, and he made himself look at them the way you were supposed to look at facts, without flinching, without negotiating. The boy had his eyes, the particular structure of his jaw. The taller girl had Elena's mouth, but Roman's coloring. The quiet girl, the one who hadn't spoken yet, had something of both her parents in a way that was almost architecturally precise, as though genetics had attempted a deliberate reconciliation between two people who had destroyed each other. "What are your names?" he said. The boy said, "Luca." The taller girl said, "Mara." The quiet girl finally spoke. Her voice was lower than her siblings, measured, and she said, "Sophia," without any particular inflection, as though she was providing data. Roman sat down in the chair across from them, which put him at roughly their eye level, and he said, "Tell me what your mother told you to tell me." Luca said, "She said to tell you that the man who showed you the evidence against her was lying. She said she has proof. She said she waited until she could be sure the proof was enough, and now she's ready to show you, but she needed to know first whether you were someone who could hear it. And how was she going to determine that? She said if you brought us in safely and didn't use us to find her, she'd know. And if I try to use you to find her?" Luca looked at him steadily. "She said she'd disappear again. She said she's been doing it for 6 years, and she's gotten very good at it." Roman was quiet for a moment. Something in his face was trying to do something he wouldn't let it do. He pressed it down the way he always pressed things down, into the place where they couldn't interfere with function. "She's gotten very good at it," he repeated. "Yes." He stood up. He walked to the door and opened it and said to Vincent, who was waiting in the corridor, "Get them food, whatever they want. Nobody comes in or out of this room without my direct order. Nobody." Vincent said, "Understood. And the mother?" "We wait," Roman said. He went to the adjacent room and closed the door and stood in the dark for a long moment before he turned the light on. His hands were steady. They were always steady, but he stood there in the sudden light of the empty room, and he thought about 6 years. He thought about signing those divorce papers with the absolute certainty of a man who believed he was cutting out something that had turned on him. He thought about the way Elena had looked when he had confronted her with the evidence. Not with guilt, not with desperation, but with a particular grief that he had at the time interpreted as regret for being caught, and now, standing in this room 6 years later, understood might have been something else entirely. He thought about 3 children who had walked into the middle of his convoy with his own eyes looking out of their faces. He picked up his phone and called the one person he trusted with actual analysis rather than loyalty performance. A man named Garrett, who worked in information and had no stake in Roman's organizational politics, because Garrett was so far outside the organizational structure that the organization barely knew he existed. "I need everything," Roman said when Garrett answered. Everything that was compiled on Elena Cross in the 18 months before the divorce. Every document, every source, every chain of custody for every piece of evidence. I need to know who handled it, who verified it, who brought it to me, and I need to know whether any single piece of it had only one point of origin. Garrett said, "That's old file. Gonna take a few hours." "You have until morning." He ended the call. He stood there a moment longer, and then he went back to the room where his children were eating sandwiches that someone on his security team had sourced from somewhere, because people in Roman's employ understood that when he gave an instruction, it was executed immediately and without question. Luca was eating with the focused efficiency of a boy who had probably been raised to not waste food or time. Mara was picking at the edges of hers and watching the door. Sophia was eating steadily and had not looked up, but when Roman came back into the room, she said without raising her head, "Are you going to try to find her before she's ready?" "No," Roman said. Sophia considered this. Then she said, "Okay." She kept eating. Roman sat down. The silence in the room had a texture to it, not comfortable, not hostile. Something stranger than either. The texture of people who are related and do not yet know what that means. Elena Cross had spent 6 years building a life that Roman DeLuca couldn't find, which meant building it from the bottom up without any thread connecting back to who she'd been before. No old contacts, no old neighborhoods, no financial institutions that crossed paths with anything Roman touched. She had taken the cash she'd managed to access in the 48 hours between the confrontation and the divorce paperwork, and she had made it last, and she had made it grow through methods that were entirely legal and entirely invisible. Bookkeeping work, online, for small businesses that didn't ask questions, which paid in transfers to accounts structured under names that were legally hers but not publicly associated with her. She had given birth to 3 children in a hospital in a city where no one knew her name. She had raised them in an apartment that was clean and small and had good locks on the doors. She had told them the truth about their father from the time they were old enough to understand it. Not the romanticized version, not the demonized version, but the actual version. A man who had been given false information and had acted on it in the most destructive way available to him, and who did not know they existed, and who was dangerous, and who was also their father. She had told them this because she had learned, in the years before the marriage ended, that the most dangerous thing you could give a child was a lie they'd eventually have to dismantle on their own. She watched her phone in the apartment that was her current base of operations. She'd moved 3 times in 6 years, each time getting slightly better at disappearing, and she waited to see what Roman would do. He had taken the children inside. He had not moved the convoy toward any location that she had previously been associated with. She knew this because she had people. Nothing like Roman's network, nothing close, but 2 careful individuals who owed her favors from before and who were good at watching without being seen. He was waiting. She had thought he would wait. The Roman she had known was reactive in moments of physical threat and calculated in everything else. And whatever this moment was to him, it wasn't a physical threat. It was something that required him to think. And when Roman DeLuca needed to think, he went very still and very quiet and processed until he had a framework for the situation that he trusted. She hoped the framework he built tonight was one that could accommodate the truth. She made herself tea and sat at the small kitchen table and thought about 6 years of silence, and about how she had protected 3 lives at the cost of any life that resembled her own, and about the man who had unmade her with a signature and an expression that she had replayed in her memory so many times it had lost all emotional texture and become simply a record of an event. She had long since stopped being angry. Anger was a luxury of people who had the time and safety to tend it. She had been too busy. What she felt now, sending her children into Roman's convoy on a rainy October evening, was something she didn't have an accurate name for. It was the feeling of a person who has been holding their breath for 6 years and has finally decided that whatever happens next, they cannot hold it any longer. Roman did not sleep that night. He sat in the room adjacent to the one where the children slept. Mara and Sophia on the couch, Luca on the floor, which had apparently been his preference and which nobody had argued with, and he read through the files that Garrett began transmitting to him at 2 in the morning. He was looking for a seam. In his experience, fabricated evidence always had a seam somewhere, a point where the construction was slightly too precise, where corroboration that should have been organic felt instead like it had been placed. Evidence that grew naturally out of real events had the texture of reality, which was slightly ragged and inconsistent and human. Fabricated evidence was cleaner. It fit together too well. The people who constructed it were always at some level optimizing for persuasiveness rather than truth, and persuasiveness required neatness. He read for 4 hours. At 6:18 in the morning, he found what he had been looking for. The documentation of Elena's contact with the rival family, a series of communications that had formed the core of the case against her, all ran through a single intermediary point before being presented to Roman. One man had received every piece of evidence and had compiled it and had brought it to Roman as a coherent package. The man's name was Donato Ferri. He had been with Roman for 11 years. He had been, for 8 of those years, Roman's consigliere, his counselor, his strategic advisor, the man Roman brought questions to when he needed a perspective he could trust. The man who occupied that position was supposed to be the person least capable of lying to you. Roman sat with this for a long time. He did not act immediately. Acting immediately on an incomplete picture was how intelligent men got killed. He instead began methodically to build the larger picture, to ask himself what Donato Ferri's interests had been 6 years ago, what they were now, what position Donato now occupied in the organization, and how he had come to occupy it, and whether the trajectory of Donato's career had benefited in specific ways from the removal of Elena Cross from the equation. By 7:40 in the morning, he had a rough answer to that last question, and the answer was yes, in ways that were specific and traceable, and, in retrospect, obvious if you were looking for them. He had not been looking for them. He had had no reason to look for them. He had trusted Donato Ferri the way you trusted the people you had built your life alongside, which was to say almost entirely, which was to say with the particular blind spot that intimacy created. He put the phone down on the table. The morning light was coming through the window of the room in a way that was aggressively neutral, the way light always was, indifferent to what it was illuminating. He thought about Donato. He thought about what it meant to have given someone 11 years of trust, and to discover that the trust had been an instrument in another man's hands. He thought about what Donato had taken from him, and what he had taken from Elena, and what both of them together had taken from 3 children who had spent 7 years without a father. He was still sitting there when the door from the children's room opened and Sophia walked in. She looked at him with that particular expression, the assessing, unhurried one. And she said, "You didn't sleep." "No." "Did you find something?" He looked at her. "What makes you think I was looking for something?" "Because you're not the kind of person who just waits," she said. "Mom said that. She said you always have to be doing something with information, even when you're being still." He was quiet a moment, then, "Your mother said that." "She talks about you sometimes," Sophia said. She walked to the window and looked out at the city, and the light came across her face, and Roman saw his own jaw and Elena's eyes, and the combination was still doing something to his chest that he hadn't found a way to neutralize yet. "Not a lot, but sometimes. She talks about what you were like before all of it." "Before all of what?" Sophia looked at him directly. "Before you forgot that the people who love you are worth more than the people who are useful to you." The sentence was delivered without accusation or performance. It was just said. The way Sophia seemed to say everything, as though she had processed it thoroughly before speaking and had therefore removed any excess emotional weight, leaving only the essential content. Roman said nothing. Sophia said, "Luca's awake. He'll want breakfast. He's always terrible before he eats." "I'll have something brought up." "Okay." She turned from the window. "Are you going to contact our mother today?" Roman said. "She'll contact me." Sophia considered this. Then she nodded, apparently finding the logic acceptable, and went back to the other room. Roman sat with the morning light and the information on his phone, and the knowledge, settling into him like something cold and very heavy, that the man he had trusted most in 11 years had used that trust to destroy the only relationship in Roman's life that had ever been, in any real sense, personal. Elena's contact came at 11 o'clock in the morning. Not a phone call. A message through a channel Roman had not used in years. A dead-drop method that he and Elena had established in the first year of their marriage, when she had been learning the operational reality of his world and had found it useful, and which had been so obscure and specific to the two of them that no one else in his organization had ever known it existed. The message was a location and a time. 2 p.m. A coffee shop in Pilsen, on the southwest side, 2 blocks from a CTA station. Public. Populated. Multiple exits. The choice of location was a statement. She would meet him in the open, where he could not leverage the situation, where witnesses existed and violence was impossible, and where she had presumably established exit routes that she knew and he didn't. She had been living in his world long enough to learn from it. Roman went alone, which required a comprehensive argument with Vincent that he was not in the mood for, and which he won by the simple expedient of getting in a cab before Vincent could organize a counterposition. He arrived at 1:47. He ordered coffee he didn't want and sat in a booth near the back wall, force of habit. And he watched the door. Elena Cross walked in at exactly 2 o'clock. 6 years had changed her in the way that hard time changed people. Not erosion exactly, but a kind of compacting, as though the softness of before had been replaced by something denser and more load-bearing. She was thinner than he remembered. Her hair was shorter. She was wearing a coat that was practical rather than beautiful, which was different from the Elena he had known, who had understood clothes as communication. She moved through the coffee shop with the careful spatial awareness of a person who had spent years tracking potential threats, and she found him in the back booth without looking for him, because she had known exactly where he would sit. She sat down across from him. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The coffee shop moved around them. The hiss of the espresso machine, low music, the murmur of other people's conversations, the ordinary texture of a world that didn't know what was sitting inside it. Roman said, "The children are safe. They're with my people." "I know," she said. "I've been watching the building since last night." He hadn't been surprised she'd say that. He was surprised to find he wasn't surprised. "You've learned some things." "I've learned a lot of things," Elena said. Her voice was the same. The specific register of it, the particular way it shaped words, and the sameness of it did something to him that he filed away and didn't examine. "Mostly I've learned things I shouldn't have needed to learn, but here we are." "Here we are." She reached into her coat and placed a drive on the table. It was small, ordinary, the kind of device you could buy at any electronics shop. "Everything that was done to construct the case against me. Original source files, metadata intact, communication records that were never shown to you. Donato Ferri's name is on almost all of it, once you know what you're looking at." Roman looked at the drive. He did not pick it up yet. "I've been looking at what was compiled this morning. I found the seam." "What seam did you find?" "Single point of collection. Everything ran through Donato before it reached me." Elena said, "That's the seam on the evidence side. What's on that drive is the construction side. How it was made, who made it, why." "Why?" Roman repeated. "He needed you to trust him completely," Elena said. Her voice was flat, empirical, as though she had spent so much time living with these facts that they had long since stopped having any emotional temperature for her. "You always trusted me more than you trusted him. Not in operational matters, you relied on him for that, but in personal matters, in matters of character. You used to say that I saw people more clearly than he did. He knew that. He resented it. And he understood that if he could remove me from the equation, if he could do it in a way that made you believe I had betrayed you, he would get two things: the removal of your most trusted outside perspective and the consolidation of your emotional dependence entirely within the organization, where he could manage it." Roman was quiet. "He didn't need to take over," Elena said. "He didn't want the top position. He's never wanted that. What he wanted was to be indispensable. What he wanted was to be the only person whose counsel you would ever take, and he achieved it. For 6 years, he achieved it." Roman picked up the drive. He held it in his palm and looked at it. "Why didn't you bring this before?" he said. "Because for the first year, I was surviving," Elena said. "Because for the second year, I was keeping 3 infants alive. Because by the 3rd year, I understood that Donato knew I existed, even if he didn't know where I was, and that any move I made to surface would give him the chance to remove me permanently. Because I needed time. I needed him to believe I had accepted my disappearance, and I needed the evidence to be so complete that when I did move, you would have no choice but to believe it. You could have come to me sooner." Elena looked at him. "Could I have?" The question sat there between them. Roman had no answer to it that was honest and also comfortable, so he didn't try to find one. "Donato is still in the organization," he said. "I know." "This morning, while I was reviewing the files," Roman stopped. He looked at the table, at the drive in his hand, at the coffee he hadn't touched. "I have reason to believe he's been aware that I acquired new information of some kind. I don't know how, but there were 3 other people who knew I was pulling those old files. One of them has a relationship with Donato's office." Elena said, "How long until he moves?" "If he thinks I'm onto him? Not long. He's careful, but he's also pragmatic. He'll want to manage the situation before it manages him." "And the children are in your building?" "Yes." "Does Donato know you have them?" Roman went very still. He thought about the convoy on Walker Drive last night. He thought about the 3 Escalades in the middle of downtown Chicago, stopped, backed up traffic, attracted attention. He thought about who among his people had known the convoy's route, and who among his people had access to Donato. He was already standing when Elena said, "Roman!" "Stay here," he said. He was already moving toward the door, phone in hand, calling Vincent, and the call connected and Vincent said, "Boss." And something in the texture of that word, something muted and strained, made Roman's stomach drop completely. "Where are the children?" Roman said. A pause. Short. Long enough. "Boss, we had a situation. Where are they, Vincent?" Another pause. And in the pause, Roman was out the door of the coffee shop and on the sidewalk in the October cold. And behind him he heard Elena's chair scrape back because she had not stayed in the coffee shop. She had never been going to stay in the coffee shop. And she was right behind him when Vincent said, "They're gone, boss. Someone hit the building 40 minutes ago. Professional. Our people are..." A breath. "3 of our people are down. The children were taken." Roman stopped walking. The city continued around him. The traffic and the wind off the lake and the ordinary noise of 11 o'clock on a weekday in Chicago. And Elena was beside him now, and he didn't have to say anything because she had heard Vincent's voice through the phone and her face had gone the color of old paper. "Donato," Roman said. Not a question. "We think so," Vincent said. "Boss, what do you—" "Find him," Roman said. "Don't touch him. Find him and stay on him and wait for me." He ended the call. He stood on the sidewalk in Pilsen in the October cold with Elena Cross beside him, and somewhere in this city, 3 7-year-old children who had walked into his convoy last night with their mother's courage, and his eyes were being moved to a location he didn't know yet by a man he had trusted for 11 years. Elena's hand found his arm. Her grip was tight. When he looked at her, her face was controlled in the way that people control their faces when the alternative is something they can't afford, and she said very quietly, "Get them back." "I will," Roman said. And the thing was, he meant it in a way that he had not meant anything in 6 years. Not with calculation, not with the cool professional certainty of a man managing a problem. He meant it from somewhere underneath all of that, somewhere that the divorce papers and the 6 years and the empire he had spent every waking hour maintaining had not entirely reached. He meant it the way a person means something when they have finally understood what they are actually protecting. He started moving. Roman moved fast, but he moved smart, which was the only way he had ever moved in situations where moving wrong meant people died. He flagged a cab on Blue Island Avenue and put Elena in it and got in after her and gave the driver an address 4 blocks from the building where the children had been taken, because arriving directly was the kind of thing you only did when you wanted to announce yourself. The cab smelled like pine air freshener and old coffee, and the driver had the radio on low, some afternoon talk show, voices discussing things that had nothing to do with the world currently inside this vehicle. Roman had his phone out and was working through his contact list with the systematic focus of a man running a checklist, not a man who was afraid, because fear was a thing that happened in the body, and you either let it run your hands or you didn't, and Roman had spent 20 years not letting it run his hands. Elena sat beside him and said nothing. She was looking straight ahead and her jaw was set, and she was doing something with her breathing, deliberately evening it. Roman recognized the technique because he used the same one, and the visible effort of that control told him more about the state of her interior than any expression she could have made. "He'll keep them alive," Roman said. "You don't know that. He needs leverage. Dead children aren't leverage." "He's had 6 years to decide what they are to him," Elena said. Her voice was flat. "6 years ago, when he found out I was pregnant, what do you think he decided?" Roman looked at her. "He knew," she said. "He found out before I even left Chicago. I know because 3 days after the divorce, someone tried to follow me. Professional. I lost them in St. Louis, but I know what professional surveillance looks like, Roman. Donato sent someone. And when they lost me, he had a choice. Keep looking or decide I was gone far enough that I wasn't his problem. He chose to decide I was gone. For 6 years, that was the calculation. But the calculation changed last night. When the convoy stopped on Wacker. When 3 children with your face stopped your convoy in the middle of downtown Chicago," Elena said. "In public. With witnesses. Whatever Donato thought had happened to us became suddenly, very visibly, unresolved." Roman absorbed this. The cab was moving north on Halsted, the city passing in the particular gray gold of Chicago October afternoons, and he thought about Donato Ferri sitting in his office this morning receiving a report about the convoy, about 3 children, about Roman pulling old files, and making a calculation of his own. The calculation of a man who had built 11 years of position on a foundation that was now visibly cracking. He moved fast, Roman said. He always moves fast when he's scared. That was always his tell. Elena finally turned to look at him. You used to know that. I used to know a lot of things, Roman said, that I stopped knowing when I stopped having a reason to look. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the windshield, and they rode the rest of the way in silence. The building had a service entrance on the south side, and Roman used it, which meant going through a loading dock that smelled like diesel and cardboard, and then a stairwell that smelled like nothing, which was worse. Vincent met them on the 4th floor, outside the room where the children had been sleeping. Vincent looked like a man who had been through something and was managing it, which meant his face was professional and his eyes were something else. He had a cut above his left ear that had been taped but not properly treated, and the collar of his shirt had blood on it that wasn't his. He looked at Elena when she came in behind Roman, and something moved across his face. Surprise, recognition, a complicated thing that he packed away before it could become a readable expression. Talk, Roman said. Vincent said, 42 minutes ago, 4-man team came in through the parking structure. They had access credentials, legitimate ones, which means someone on our payroll gave them the codes. They went directly to this floor, took the children in under 4 minutes. A pause. Luca fought them. The older one, the boy, he fought them. Roman said nothing. Elena made a sound, very small, that she contained immediately. Our 3 men on this floor, Vincent said. Martinez is in surgery. Cho and Reyes are stable. The team used tranquilizers on them, not... He stopped, recalibrated. They weren't killed, that's something. Who gave them the credentials, Roman said. I have a candidate. Name. Pete Saldo. He's been on building security for 7 months. Before that, he was with, Donato's peripheral network, Roman said. I know who Pete Saldo was before. I approved his hire. He said it without inflection. The fact of it sat in the air. Vincent said, I have him in the room at the end of the hall. Roman started walking. Elena fell into step beside him, and Vincent moved to intercept her, not aggressively, but with the body language of a man about to raise an objection, and Roman said, She stays with me, without stopping, and Vincent absorbed this and let it go. Pete Saldo was 26 years old, sat in a chair in the center of a room that had been cleared of everything except the chair, and he was scared in the specific way that people were scared when they had already understood exactly how bad their situation was. He was still doing the math on outcomes, which meant he hadn't yet crossed into the place where people stopped talking. Roman had learned to recognize that window. He pulled a chair from against the wall and sat directly in front of Saldo, close enough that it was uncomfortable, and he said, Where did they take the children? Saldo said, I don't know. Who contracted you? I don't... Pete. Roman's voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. I have 3 men in the hospital and 3 children somewhere in this city, and I have approximately 30 seconds of patience left for a conversation that I'm going to have one way or another. Where you are at the end of it depends entirely on whether you decide in the next 30 seconds to be useful. Saldo was sweating. His hands, on his thighs, were pressing flat in the way that hands did when the person they belonged to was trying not to let them shake visibly. He looked at Roman, and then he looked past Roman at Elena, and something in his face shifted. Recognition, Roman thought, but from where? How did Saldo know Elena's face? Elena stepped forward from beside the door. Her voice was quiet and very even, and she said, You know who I am. Saldo's jaw tightened. You've seen my photograph, Elena said. Donato showed it to you, or someone in Donato's circle did, because I've been a person of interest in that office for 6 years, even when everyone pretended I was gone. She moved closer, and Roman watched her do it and recognized the technique, the steady movement into someone's space, not aggressive, just inexorable. He told you to watch for me. That's why you took the placement 7 months ago. You weren't just building security, Pete. You were a positioned asset waiting for the situation to develop. Saldo said nothing. but he wasn't denying it. "The children are mine," Elena said. "They are 7 years old, and the man who has them is going to hurt them the moment he believes they're no longer useful to him." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "The address, that's all I'm asking for. One address." Saldo looked at the floor. "He told you I'd come," Elena said. "He planned for it. He gave you a script for this conversation. I know how Donato works, Pete. I know every tool he uses. But I also know he doesn't protect the people below him when the protection becomes costly. He never has. The moment you became a liability, he cut you off. And you're a liability right now." Saldo's hands stopped pressing flat. They came up slowly and covered his face, and he sat like that for a long moment, and Roman watched Elena watch him and thought, she learned to do this somewhere in 6 years of being alone and surviving on her wits, and the thought was not comfortable. Saldo said, into his hands, "Riverside. There's an old processing facility on the South Branch, Meridian Cold Storage. It's been closed for 3 years. He owns it through a holding company." He dropped his hands. His face was the face of a man who had just stepped off a ledge. "He'll have 6 men there, minimum. He keeps a private detail of 8, but 2 of them are assigned to external perimeter work, so 6 inside. Any additional personnel?" "I don't know. He may have called in support. If he thinks this is the endgame situation, he may have called in support." Roman stood. "Vincent." Vincent appeared in the doorway. "I heard. Meridian Cold Storage. I want a full picture of that facility in 20 minutes. Building plans, sight lines, known vehicle access. I want to know every way in and out of that building before we move." He looked at Saldo. "You're going to stay in this room until this is finished, and what happens to you afterward depends on whether what you just told me is accurate." Saldo nodded. He looked like a man who had already accepted the consequences of today and was just waiting to find out their shape. Roman walked out. Elena was a step behind him. In the corridor, away from the room, she caught his arm and turned him toward her and said, very quietly, "He'll have them on an upper floor. He always puts things he wants to preserve on upper floors." "How do you know that?" "Because I spent 2 years watching how he moved through spaces," Elena said. "Before I understood what he was, I just thought he was cautious. Afterward, I understood it was control. He likes elevation. He likes to be able to see everything below him." She met Roman's eyes. "The children will be alive. He needs them to draw you in. But the moment you arrive and he has you in a controlled space, the equation changes." "I know." "He'll try to use them as the terms of your surrender," Elena said. "He'll offer you a choice. Walk away from the organization, sign over control, or he escalates. He's been waiting for this. He's been building toward a position where he can force a clean transfer without violence. He started with violence tonight. He started with efficiency," Elena said. "To him, those are different things." She paused. "Roman, he is not going to let them walk out of there. Whatever he tells you about the terms, he doesn't intend to let them walk out. They know his face. They know what was said in that room last night. They are 7 years old, and they will remember everything, and eventually they'll be in a position to say something to someone." Roman looked at her. "You're telling me don't negotiate." "I'm telling you to go in knowing what the real situation is," Elena said, "not the situation he presents to you." The corridor was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, Vincent was already on the phone. Roman could hear the low, quick rhythm of it. Names, locations, logistics being assembled. The machinery of violence being organized in the direction of a specific target. He had set this machinery in motion hundreds of times. He had never before set it in motion for this reason. "You're not coming," he said. Elena said, "Watch me." "Elena, they are my children, Roman." No heat in it, no desperation, just the factual weight of 7 years of a woman who had already decided. "I have been the only thing standing between them and this world since before they were born. I'm not going to sit somewhere and wait while someone else decides whether they live or die." Roman looked at her for a long moment. "You do what I tell you when we're inside," he said. "Within reason," she said. It wasn't a comfortable answer. He accepted it because the alternative was losing time arguing, and time was the only resource he couldn't get more of. Vincent assembled the picture in 18 minutes, which was 3 minutes better than asked, and spread it across a table in the main room. Building schematics pulled from city records, satellite imagery, the layout of the Meridian facility cross-referenced with notes from a man in Roman's network who had done work in that building 2 years prior, before its closure. Concrete and steel, 4 stories, river access on the west side, 2 vehicle entrances, a loading dock on the south face. The upper floors had been used for refrigerated storage and still had internal structural partitions that created a series of contained spaces, the kind of spaces where you put things you wanted controlled. Elena had been right about that. Roman's available personnel, men he trusted completely, not the broader organizational force, because the broader organizational force had just demonstrated it contained at least one compromised position, numbered 11, against a minimum of 6 potentially supplemented. Not comfortable odds in a facility whose floor plan favored defenders. He looked at the schematic and thought about the problem the way he always thought about problems. Not from where he was, but from where he wanted to end up, and then backward to the necessary steps. Where he wanted to end up was simple. 3 children alive and out of the building. Every other consideration was secondary. Riverside, he said. They'll have the vehicle entrances covered. The Riverside has a loading platform that's been inactive since closure. No vehicle access, which means it's probably the lowest priority on their external coverage. Vincent said, "It'll be cold entry. No cover once we're on the platform." "Yes, that's going to cost us." "It's going to cost us less than the front," Roman said. "We're not trying to win a tactical engagement. We're trying to reach one floor of one building fast enough that they don't have time to change the equation." Vincent studied the schematic. Roman watched him work through it, Vincent's face in calculation mode, cross-referencing what was on the table with what he knew about human behavior under pressure and spatial constraint. Vincent was not brilliant, but he was experienced in a way that was sometimes better than brilliant, and Roman had trusted his assessments for 9 years. 20 minutes to position, Vincent said. We go in 2 elements. River entry as primary, simultaneous distraction at the south vehicle entrance, not a breach, just enough noise to pull attention inward. Split the team, Roman said. 6 on the river entry, 4 on the distraction, 1 stays with the vehicle. And her? Vincent looked at Elena. Elena said before Roman could answer, I go with the river entry. I know what my children look like when they're frightened. You don't. There are things you can say to a 7-year-old in the first 10 seconds that determine whether they freeze or they move. And I'm the only person in this room who knows what to say to these 3. Vincent looked at Roman. Roman said, She's right. Vincent absorbed this without visible reaction, which was one of the things Roman valued most about him. He nodded once and turned back to the schematic and began allocating personnel. They moved out at 4:47 in the afternoon. The light by then was going amber and thin, the October sun already low, already tired. The river when they reached it was the color of old iron, and it moved with the particular heaviness of deep water in cold weather. The Meridian facility sat back from the river by 30 feet, its western face blank concrete with the loading platform jutting out over the water on steel struts that had not been maintained in 3 years. Roman stood at the river's edge with Elena and Vincent and 5 other men and looked at the platform and the building behind it and thought, somewhere inside that building, 3 children are either sitting still the way their mother taught them to or they are not, and either way, they are waiting. His earpiece gave a click, the distraction element in position at the south entrance. He looked at Elena. She was looking at the building. Her face was the face of someone who had burned everything that wasn't essential, and what was left was intention, clean and absolute. Ready, he said. Yes, she said. He keyed his radio. Move. They went across the platform at a low run, 7 people moving with the coordinated silence of training and necessity, and behind them the river moved its slow cold iron movement, indifferent as always, and ahead the building waited with whatever it contained. They hit the loading door, and Vincent's man with the entry tools had it open in 40 seconds. And they poured through into the cold, dark interior, and Roman's eyes adjusted, and he smelled the particular smell of an abandoned industrial space, rust and cold, and the ghost of refrigerant. And somewhere above them, on one of the upper floors, there was a sound. Footsteps. Someone moving fast. They had been heard coming in. Roman keyed his radio and said, "They know we're here." And from the south side came the sound of the distraction element making noise at the vehicle entrance. A controlled commotion designed to pull attention south. And Roman was already moving for the internal stairwell because they had perhaps 30 seconds before Donato's men reorganized around the correct understanding of what was happening. The stairwell door was metal, heavy, cold under his hand. He pushed through it and took the stairs fast, Vincent behind him, Elena behind Vincent, and behind her 3 of the remaining men. And the sound of footsteps from above was getting closer now, and Roman was moving up through the dark, cold stairwell, and on the 3rd-floor landing he came around the corner and stopped. A man he didn't know was standing on the landing with a weapon raised, and for one compressed second they looked at each other, and then everything happened at once. The shot went into the concrete wall to Roman's left. Roman moved right, and Vincent came around him, and the man on the landing was handled in 3 seconds, efficiently and finally, and the sound of it echoed up and down the stairwell in a way that meant every person in this building now understood that the nature of the situation had changed. Roman took the next flight of stairs at a dead run, the 4th floor. He hit the door and it opened into a corridor lined with the partitioned storage spaces Elena had described. Doors on both sides, and at the far end of the corridor 2 men were moving toward him with weapons out, and he went left into the first door opening and pulled Elena through it, and Vincent and his people engaged the corridor, and the noise was enormous in the concrete space, enormous and final. Roman held Elena against the wall in the partitioned space, and she was not shaking, and neither was he. And through the noise in the corridor he heard something else, a voice, a child's voice, not crying, not screaming, a voice saying something with the flat, determined precision of a child who has been told exactly what to do in this situation and has decided to do it. "That's Luca," Elena said. She had heard it too. The voice was coming from behind the door directly across the corridor. Roman looked at the door. He looked at the corridor where Vincent's people were working through the situation. He looked at Elena. She was already moving for the door before he could say anything. He went after her. The door was not locked. Why would it be locked when you had men in the corridor? And it opened into a space that had once been a refrigerated storage room and was now empty except for a folding table, 3 chairs, and 3 children sitting in those chairs with their hands in their laps, with the exact posture of people who had been told to sit and had decided to comply not out of fear but out of tactical calculation. Luca was in the center. He had a bruise developing on his left cheekbone, from fighting them in the other building, Roman understood, from Vincent's report. He looked up when the door opened, and something in his face changed when he saw his mother. But he didn't move immediately because he was still assessing, still running the calculation, and Roman thought, 7 years old, and he's running the calculation. Then Elena crossed the room, and all 3 children came off their chairs at once, and she had her arms around all 3 of them, and the calculation was finished. Roman stood in the doorway and watched this, and felt something happen in his chest that he didn't have a word for and didn't try to name. Then Sophia looked up at him from inside her mother's arms. Her face was the same as always, assessing, unhurried, the face of a person who had already decided what things meant before she showed you she had decided. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "There's one more. He's not here." Roman said, "What?" "The man in charge," Sophia said. "He left 10 minutes before you came in. He got a phone call and he left." A pause. "He said he'd be back. He said he had something else to take care of first." Roman's blood went cold. Elena felt it, felt the shift in the room, and she looked up at Roman over the children's heads, and in her eyes was the same recognition that was moving through him now. If Donato had left this building 10 minutes ago, and if he had received a phone call that told him Roman was coming here, then someone had warned him. And if someone had warned him, then Donato had known Roman's response was coming before Roman had deployed it. And if Donato had known that, then leaving the building wasn't retreat. Leaving the building was a pivot to a different objective. Roman's phone rang. He looked at the screen. The number was one he recognized, a line that ran through his own organizational infrastructure, an internal number which meant it was being called from inside his own network. He answered. Donato Ferri's voice said very calmly, "I think we should talk, Roman, before this goes any further." A pause, and in the pause Roman heard something, a background sound, an ambient quality that was familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place. "I'm at your home, the one on the North Shore. I want you to understand that I didn't come here to do anything drastic. I came here to negotiate." Roman said nothing. "But I need you to understand," Donato said, "that I have a position here which I intend to maintain until we reach an agreement. I've been building toward this conversation for 11 years. I'd prefer to have it without anyone else getting hurt." The background sound. Roman placed it now, the specific acoustic quality of the large open living room in the North Shore house, the way sound moved in that space, the slight echo off the water-facing windows. He had people at that house, 3 of his household staff and 2 security men. "If you've hurt anyone in that house," Roman said. "I haven't," Donato said. "I want to be clear about that. I want to be clear about what I want and what I'm willing to do to get it. Come and talk to me, Roman. Bring the children if you want. I'm not interested in them anymore. They were only ever leverage to get you to this conversation." A pause. "Come alone." The line went quiet. Roman stood in the doorway of the 4th-floor storage room with Elena behind him and 3 children who had his eyes and his blood and his stubborn refusal to show fear. And he looked at the phone in his hand, and he understood that the situation had just changed in a direction that Donato had planned for and Roman had not, and that the man who had spent 11 years as his most trusted advisor had spent those 11 years learning exactly how Roman DeLuca thought and exactly what moves Roman DeLuca would make, and had built a trap around that knowledge so precisely that Roman was now looking at the entrance of it with no clear picture of what was waiting inside. He had 3 children alive and a building full of unconscious and incapacitated men, and a woman who had survived 6 years on her own looking at him with the eyes of someone who already understood what he was about to say. He keyed his radio. "Vincent, status on the building." "Clear," Vincent said. "All hostiles neutralized. We're clear." "Good." Roman looked at Elena. "Get the children out. Get them somewhere clean and stay there until I call you." Elena said, "Roman." "Donato is at the North Shore house," Roman said. "He's there alone, or he wants me to believe he's there alone, and he wants to negotiate. He thinks he's in a position to negotiate." Roman put the phone in his pocket. "He spent 11 years learning how I think. The one thing he never learned was how I act when there's nothing left to calculate." Elena looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm done calculating," Roman said. He held her gaze for one more second, and then he turned and walked toward the stairwell. And behind him he heard Sophia say to her mother, very quietly, "He's going to be okay." And Elena said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, "I know." The North Shore house sat on a private lot off Sheridan Road, lakefront, separated from the neighboring properties by mature trees that had been there longer than Roman's ownership and would be there long after. He had bought it 7 years ago as a place that was not the organization. No meetings, no business, no men with weapons in the corridors. Elena had lived there with him for 14 months before everything ended. She had planted something in the back garden, some kind of climbing thing against the stone wall, and he had never removed it, which was the one sentimental fact about Roman DeLuca that he had never examined too closely. He came up Sheridan in a car he had taken from the Meridian Facilities parking structure, nondescript, not registered to anything connected to him, and he parked 2 properties south and walked the rest of the way through the tree line with the cold lake air coming off the water and the last of the October light dying in the west behind him. He went over the stone wall at the garden side. The climbing thing Elena had planted was still there. It had grown considerably in 6 years, and had taken most of the wall, and in the dark it was just a mass of dry vine and the ghost of summer leaves, and Roman put his hand on it briefly as he came over the wall, not sentimentally, just using it for purchase. And then he was in the garden and moving toward the house. The lights were on in the main room. He could see the glow through the water-facing windows, diffused and even, the kind of light that said someone had turned on the overheads rather than the lamps, which meant someone who didn't know the house well enough to know that the overhead lights in that room created an unpleasant institutional quality that Elena had complained about from the first week, and that Roman had thereafter never used. Donato didn't know the house well. He knew Roman's offices, his vehicles, his operational habits. He had never been invited here. Roman went in through the kitchen entrance at the north face, which required bypassing a security panel that he had the code to and which had apparently not been discovered or altered. And then he was inside and the house smelled like itself. The particular layered smell of a place that was cleaned regularly but rarely occupied, something neutral and faintly mineral from the lake proximity. He moved through the kitchen to the corridor and down the corridor toward the main room. And he made no particular effort at silence, because silence at this point would have been a performance rather than a tactic. Donato knew he was coming. The phone call had been an invitation. The only question was what Donato had arranged inside the invitation. He came into the main room. Donato Ferri was sitting in the chair beside the fireplace, the one that faced the lake windows. He was 61 years old and looked it, but in the way of a man who had earned his age rather than suffered it. Broad through the shoulders, gray at the temples, with a face that had always projected a specific kind of gravity that Roman had spent 11 years interpreting as wisdom and was now reprocessing as something else, something more calculated. He was wearing a dark jacket and no tie, and he had a glass of something on the side table beside him, and the glass was Roman's, from Roman's cabinet, poured without invitation, and somehow that detail was the one that made Roman's jaw tighten. There were two men standing at the far wall, both armed, both professional, both watching Roman with the flat attention of men being paid to maintain a specific situation. Roman looked at them, then at Donato. "You said alone." "I said come alone," Donato said. "I didn't say I would be." He gestured toward the chair across from him with the ease of a man comfortable in a space that wasn't his. "Sit down, Roman." Roman didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room and looked at Donato and tried to see the man he had known for 11 years inside the man currently sitting in his chair with two armed bodyguards and a glass of his whiskey. And the overlap between those two images was thinner than he'd expected. Maybe he had always been looking at a performance. Maybe the performance had simply become so familiar he had stopped seeing it as one. "The children are out," Roman said. "They're safe. Whatever you thought you had, you don't have it." Donato nodded slowly. "I know, I heard from the facility." A pause. "That was faster than I expected. You moved faster than I expected." "You've been predicting my movements for 11 years. "I have," Donato said. He said it without any particular shame, which was somehow more offensive than if he had tried to qualify it. "I'm very good at it. You're a consistent man, Roman. Your strengths and your patterns are deeply connected. That's true of most exceptional people." "Is this the part where you explain yourself?" Roman said. "It's the part where I offer you a resolution," Donato said. "Sit down." Roman sat. Not because he was told to, but because standing while Donato sat was a posture of aggression. And aggression right now was a card he wanted to keep unplayed until he understood the full table. Donato looked at him with the expression Roman had seen across hundreds of tables. Patient, analytical, the expression of a man who processed situations in structural terms rather than emotional ones. For the first time, Roman looked at that expression and saw it for what it was. Not wisdom, not objectivity. A kind of effectlessness that had always been pointed at an outcome. "You found the evidence," Donato said. "The construction of the case against Elena." "Yes." "All of it, or just the seam?" "Enough," Roman said. Donato nodded. He picked up the glass and held it but didn't drink. "I want you to understand something, Roman. Everything I did in the interest of the organization. Not my personal interest. The organization's interest. That's the story you're going to tell. It's not a story. Elena Cross was a liability. Not because she was untrustworthy. She was actually one of the most trustworthy people in your life, which was exactly the problem. She was a civilian. She had moral boundaries that she would not cross, and she had influence over you that operated outside organizational logic." He set the glass down. "She would have eventually asked you to make a choice between her values and operational necessity. You would have made the wrong choice. I protected you from that." Roman said very quietly, "You fabricated evidence against my wife." I constructed a situation that allowed you to remove a vulnerability cleanly, Donato said. The alternative was a prolonged deterioration that would have fractured your authority and exposed the organization to external pressure. What I did was surgical, efficient, and it worked for 6 years. She was pregnant, Roman said. A pause. Something moved across Donato's face. Not guilt, exactly, but a kind of recalibration, a man acknowledging a complication in a plan. I discovered that afterward. I sent someone to assess. And then you let her disappear. I let her disappear because disappearing was the cleanest outcome. Dead was messier and unnecessary. Gone was sufficient. He looked at Roman evenly. I want you to hear me say that. I chose not to have her harmed. I want credit for that choice. The sentence sat in the air between them, and Roman looked at it and felt something move through him that was below anger, was older than anger, was the thing that anger was a translation of when it couldn't find a direct expression. You want credit, Roman said. I want acknowledgement of where the lines were drawn. I am not a savage, Roman. I made strategic decisions within a framework of necessity, and I drew lines at the places I believed were essential. She spent 6 years hiding, Roman said, alone. 3 children. Running from the possibility that someone in my network would find them. That is what your framework of necessity produced. Donato looked at him steadily. Yes, and the organization remained intact. Your authority remained intact. Your position was never seriously challenged from within or without for 6 years. That is also what my framework produced. Roman was quiet. He could feel the 2 men at the far wall as presences, weight and attention, weapons that existed in the room whether drawn or not. He was doing the calculation that he always did, the spatial and tactical and probabilistic calculation that ran underneath every other thought. Exit routes, distance to Donato, distance to the 2 men, available objects in the room, his own weapon, which he had not drawn and which Donato's people had not attempted to take when he entered, which was itself information of some kind. You said you wanted to offer a resolution, Roman said. I want a clean transition, Donato said. Not a coup, not a violent seizure. A documented, structured transfer of operational authority to myself, which you execute voluntarily, after which you are free to do whatever you want with your family situation. The children, Elena, none of that interests me anymore. The moment you're out of the organization, the equation changes. You become a private citizen with a complicated past and no operational significance. And if I don't, Donato said, then I use what I've spent 11 years building, every relationship, every piece of institutional knowledge, every alliance I've cultivated in parallel to your primary structure. I've been building a shadow organization within yours for 4 years, Roman. Not to take over violently. That was never the goal. The goal was always to be in a position where you would make a rational choice when I presented it. He paused. You are a rational man. This is the rational choice. Roman looked at him. He looked at the man who had sat across tables from him for 11 years and had filtered every piece of information that reached him and had shaped the architecture of his understanding of his own organization and had removed the one person whose judgment Roman had trusted because that person's judgment was independent of Donato's influence. He thought about the drive Elena had placed on the table in the coffee shop in Pilsen. The original source files, the construction of the evidence, everything documented, provenance intact. He thought about what that documentation was worth and to whom it was worth it. He said, you mentioned a shadow organization. Yes. Built within my structure. Over 4 years. Correct. Then you have people in my current operational network, Roman said. Not just Pete Saldo on building security. Active people. At what level? Donato's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The faint satisfaction of a man being asked the questions he expected. Several levels. Give me names. That's not how this negotiation works, Roman. I'm trying to understand the scope of what I'd be transferring, Roman said. His voice was still even. The calculation was still running underneath it. If the organization I transfer to you is already significantly yours, then the value of what I'm being asked to sign over is different from what I understood it to be. Donato looked at him. He was deciding something. Roman could see it, the slight pause in Donato's characteristic fluency, the moment where the man who was very good at reading Roman DeLuca was attempting to read him now and determine whether the question was genuine or tactical. He decided it was genuine, which told Roman something important about how completely Donato believed he had this room controlled. "You're head of West Side Distribution," Donato said. "Your port liaison. 2 members of your financial structure. And Vincent Caruso." The room went very quiet. Roman heard the name, and he sat with it for 1 full second, while the world reorganized itself around it, and he thought about 9 years, and he thought about a man who had said "boss" in a tone of voice that Roman had at the time interpreted as competence under pressure, and was now reinterpreting with the new information that everything that man had said and done in the past 4 years had been filtered through a second allegiance. He thought about the raid on the Meridian facility. He thought about the fact that Donato had left 10 minutes before they arrived. He thought about who had known the deployment details. He thought about Vincent saying, "I heard," when Roman had outlined the plan, saying it from the doorway of Pete Saldo's room. He thought about the phone call that had warned Donato. "Vincent," Roman said. The word came out the same as everything else. Flat, controlled, a word in a sentence. But in his chest something was occurring that he couldn't fully contain, a structural collapse of a kind of trust that had been load-bearing for 9 years. "He's been mine for 22 months, Donato said. "He didn't come cheaply. He also didn't come willingly, initially, but people are adjustable under the right pressure." A pause. "He's outside this house right now, Roman. He came up with you, followed at distance. He's been keeping me informed of your movements since you left the Meridian facility." Roman said nothing. "He let the children be rescued," Donato said. "I want to be clear about that. That was a line he drew. He's not a man who harms children. He simply informed me of the operational timeline so I could maintain my position here rather than be caught off guard." Roman was looking at the fireplace. The fire was not lit. The grate was clean. Nobody had lit a fire in this house in years, and Donato had sat down in front of it anyway, because the chair was positioned to face both the room entrance and the window, and Donato was, always, about position. "What you're telling me," Roman said slowly, "is that I walked into this house with a man who has been reporting to you for 22 months, and that he is currently outside this house, and that you have 2 armed men in this room, and that I came here without backup because you asked me to come alone and I came alone." Donato said, "Yes, that's what I'm telling you." "You want me to see the completeness of it," Roman said. "You want me to understand that there is no version of this where I fight my way out." "I want you to understand that I'm offering you something real," Donato said. "An exit, a clean one, with your family intact." He leaned forward slightly. "I don't want you dead, Roman. I never wanted that. You're the foundation on which everything I've built is constructed. Without your name, without your reputation, without the 15 years of your work that created this organization, there's nothing for me to take. I need you to exit cleanly. I need your name to remain associated with a voluntary transition. That's worth more to me than any other outcome." Roman looked at him. He looked at the 2 men at the wall. He looked at the dark window where the lake would be visible in daylight, where the water moved its cold, indifferent movement against the November shore. He put his hand in his jacket pocket and felt the phone and thought about Elena in whatever location Vincent had theoretically arranged for her and the children, except that Vincent was not on Roman's side and had not been for 22 months, which meant whatever location Vincent had arranged was a location Donato either already knew or could know within minutes of making a call. He felt the floor of the situation. He had been in rooms with no exits before. He had been in rooms where the math of survival required doing something that looked from the outside like surrender. He had learned a long time ago that the word surrender was imprecise. What looked like surrender from the outside was sometimes the only angle from which a next move was available. He said, "I need to make a call." Donato said, "To whom?" "Elena," Roman said. "She doesn't know where I am. She'll move the children if she can't reach me, and if she moves the children without coordination, I don't know where they'll go." Donato looked at him, reading him, processing the request against his model of Roman DeLuca's decision architecture. "Make the call," Donato said. "Speaker." Roman took the phone out and dialed. It rang twice before Elena picked up. Her voice was immediate and clipped. "Roman? Where are you?" "North Shore House," Roman said, "with Donato. I'm putting you on speaker." A pause. 1 second. Elena processing. "Okay," she said. I need you to stay where you are, Roman said. Don't move the children until I tell you. Can you do that? Yes, Elena said. And then, with the precision of a woman who had spent 6 years surviving on her ability to read situations through incomplete information, she said, Is the person who set up our current location trustworthy? Roman looked at Donato. Donato was watching him with the attention of a man who understood that something was happening in this call that he might not have full visibility into. Roman said, No. Elena said, Understood. We moved 20 minutes ago. We're somewhere he doesn't know. A pause. The drive is with someone outside the organization. I sent it 2 hours ago. It's already been received. Roman said, Who? Marcus Webb, Elena said. The room changed. Not physically. The room was identical. Same furniture, same 2 men at the wall, same Donato in the chair with his glass and his certainty. But the temperature of the situation changed the way a room changed when a window was opened in cold weather, a sudden draft from a direction that hadn't existed a moment before. Marcus Webb was the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois. He was also, in a professional capacity, the person who had been building a case against Roman DeLuca's organization for 4 of the past 6 years. He was not Roman's friend. He was not Roman's ally. He was the man who had, in Roman's considered assessment, the best chance of eventually putting Roman in a federal facility for a significant portion of his remaining life. He was also, Roman now recalled, someone Elena Cross had known before Roman, someone she had met in law school, in a world that had existed before Roman, in a life that Donato had decided made her a liability. The drive, Roman said, with the construction of the evidence, the documentation of the fabrication, Donato's name, his communications, his source materials, all of it. All of it, Elena confirmed. Webb has it. He's been waiting for something like this for years. He knows who Donato is. He has his own file. Ours just completed the picture. Roman looked at Donato. Donato's face had changed. It was the first time in 11 years that Roman had seen Donato's face change in a way that wasn't controlled. The gravity was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, and the shift had made it into something that looked, Roman thought, very much like a man realizing that the room he believed he had controlled completely had just revealed a wall he hadn't known was there. You contacted a federal prosecutor, Donato said. His voice was even, admirably so. But it was even in the way of a man working to make it even, rather than a man for whom it naturally was. She contacted an old friend, Roman said, with documentation of a federal crime. He paused. Which changes the nature of what you're holding in this room, Donato. You're not holding a negotiation anymore. You're holding a hostage, and the person whose cooperation you need to make your voluntary transfer look clean is the person whose cooperation, if you harm him, becomes the centerpiece of a federal prosecution that already has your name on it. The 2 men at the wall were looking at Donato now rather than at Roman, which was information. Donato said, The documentation can be contested, chain of custody arguments, source credibility. This is not a clean case simply because it's enough to open an investigation, Roman said. It's enough to freeze organizational assets while the investigation proceeds. It's enough to make every relationship you've spent 4 years building inside my structure recalculate their own exposure and start making their own calls to their own lawyers. He leaned forward. You built a shadow organization inside mine, Donato. A shadow organization is only as strong as the confidence of the people in it. The moment those people understand that a federal investigation is incoming, that confidence evaporates. They don't hold. They've never held. People in our business do not hold when federal prosecutors enter the room. Donato was very still. You built your position on the assumption that you understood how I would move, Roman said. You were right about most of it. You were right that I'm consistent. You were right that I'm rational. What you were wrong about is what I'm rational in service of. He sat back. I'm not rational in service of the organization. I never was. The organization was rational in service of something else. You never understood what that something else was because you spent 11 years removing the one person who could have shown you. The fire grate was empty, and the room was cold, and the lake was doing its cold business outside the window, and Donato Ferri sat in a chair that wasn't his, and looked at Roman DeLuca with the expression of a man recalculating in real time and finding that the calculation was not arriving at the outcome he had engineered it for. One of the men at the wall said, "Mr. Ferry?" Donato raised one hand slightly, a gesture that meant, "Wait." "What do you want?" Donato said. His voice had shed something. The performative gravity, the counselor's measured cadence. What was left was older and more basic. A man talking to another man about the actual terms. Roman said, "The names. Every name in your shadow structure. Every communication, every arrangement, every financial instrument you've used to build parallel control. All of it, documented and signed. In exchange for what? In exchange for the fact that the documentation Elena sent to Marcus Webb was sent to Marcus Webb personally, not filed. It's in his hands, not the system's, which means there's a window, a short one, in which this can be resolved without a federal case being opened." Roman looked at him. "You give me the names and the documentation and you remove yourself from Chicago, not the organization. You're done with the organization, effective tonight. You remove yourself and you stay removed, and the drive stays with Webb as insurance." "If I give you the names," Donato said, "I'm giving you the leverage to have me killed at any point of your choosing." "Yes," Roman said. "That's the nature of what you're being offered." Donato looked at him. "You said you never wanted me dead," Roman said. "I'm telling you the same thing. I want you gone. Gone is sufficient." He used Donato's own words deliberately, and he watched Donato recognize them, and he watched the recognition move through Donato's face like something cold. "But gone with documentation, so that the choice to keep you alive or not stays mine." The two men at the wall were still watching Donato. Roman watched them watching him, and he understood that whatever Donato decided in the next 60 seconds, these two men would follow it, and whatever he decided would determine whether this room resolved itself through an agreement or through something that would make everything that had happened in the past 24 hours look like a prelude. Donato picked up his glass. He looked at it. He set it down without drinking. He said, "Vincent is outside." "I know. He'll need to be dealt with." "That's my problem," Roman said. "Not yours." Another silence. The longest one. Roman sat in it without moving, without giving Donato the relief of any readable expression, without doing anything except being present in the room with the completeness that the situation required. Donato said, "I'll need 2 hours to compile what you're asking for." "You have one," Roman said. Donato looked at him for one more moment. Then he reached into his jacket and removed his phone and began making calls. And Roman sat across from him in the cold, unlived-in room of a house where Elena had once planted something against the garden wall and watched the man who had taken 11 years from him begin the process of accounting for it. Outside, somewhere in the dark perimeter of the property, Vincent Caruso was waiting with his phone and his 22 months of divided loyalty, and Roman was going to have to walk out of this house and face that, and he had no clean way through it. And he was going to do it anyway, because clean ways through things had stopped being available to him approximately 24 hours ago, and what was left now was just the thing itself, raw and without the comfort of strategy. He sat and waited, and the lake moved outside the window, and the house was cold, and the fire grate was empty, and somewhere across the city 3 children were sitting in a room that their mother had chosen and deemed safe. And the fact of that, the fact of them existing and safe, in a room their mother had chosen, was the thing Roman held on to while the man across from him made his phone calls and the hour counted down. Donato compiled for 53 minutes. Roman sat across from him the entire time and watched him work, which was not comfortable for either of them and was designed not to be. The two men at the wall had gradually shifted from active security posture into something more like witnesses. Still armed, still present, but the energy in the room had changed when Donato began making calls and signing documents, and armed men were good at reading rooms, and what this room now read yet was paperwork rather than confrontation. Roman used the 53 minutes. Not visibly. He sat still, which was the one thing he had always been able to do better than almost anyone he had encountered, sit in apparent stillness while the interior ran at full capacity. He was mapping what Donato gave him against what he already knew, cross-referencing names as they surfaced in documents, building the picture of 4 years of internal construction that had been happening underneath the organization he believed he ran. It was extensive, more extensive than he had estimated. Donato had not been building a shadow organization in the loose, informal sense that Roman had imagined when he said the word. He had been building an actual parallel structure, financial instruments, communication channels, a chain of obligation and compensation that ran through Roman's network like a second nervous system. 14 people at operational levels, not all of them fully committed. Several appeared to be people Donato had compromised rather than recruited, people who were in Donato's structure because Donato had information about them that they didn't want surfaced. Different from loyalty. More reliable in some ways. Harder to flip. Vincent Caruso's name appeared in the financial records at the 22-month mark exactly as Donato had said. The amount was significant. Roman looked at the number and held it in his mind alongside 9 years of mornings and operations and the particular weight of a voice in his earpiece that he had trusted as reflexively as his own heartbeat. And he didn't let himself feel it yet because feeling it now would cost him function, and function was the only currency that mattered in the next several hours. At 53 minutes, Donato put a signed document on the table in front of Roman and said, "That's everything." Roman picked it up. He read it. He read it again. He looked at Donato. "The port liaison is your brother-in-law," Roman said. "Yes." "You compromised your own brother-in-law," Donato said. "He made choices that gave me the instrument. I used the instrument." He said it without inflection. "Family and business have always been separate categories for me. You know that." Roman put the document in his jacket. "The two men." Donato looked at the two men at the wall. Something passed between them. The look of an employer, releasing an obligation. Both men moved to the far door and left without a word. Roman listened to their footsteps on the hardwood, fading, and then the sound of the exterior door, and then nothing. "We're finished," Donato said. He didn't say it with defeat. He said it the way he said everything, as an assessment of a situation. "I want you to know that I believed I was right. I still believe it. What I built because I thought it was what the organization required and what you were incapable of providing for yourself. You thought I was incapable of running my own life. I thought you were incapable of running it without sentiment getting into the machinery," Donato said. "I was trying to protect you from that. And the 3 children who grew up without a father." Donato was quiet a moment. "That was the cost of the outcome I was managing for. I acknowledged the cost." Roman stood. He looked at Donato Ferri one last time, at the face he had read as wisdom for 11 years, at the eyes that had always been pointed at an outcome rather than at him, and he said, "Get out of Chicago tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight." Donato stood. He was 61 years old, and he moved like it now, something in the economy of his movement that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening. He picked up his jacket from the arm of the chair and put it on, and he walked toward the exterior door, and he stopped with his hand on the frame, and he said, without turning around, "The organization won't survive without someone running it properly. You should think about that." "I have thought about it," Roman said. Donato left. Roman stood in the empty room for 10 seconds. Then he went to the exterior door and opened it and stood on the stone step in the cold lake air and looked out at the dark property and said into the darkness, "Vincent." A long pause. Then footsteps on the gravel path, and Vincent Caruso came out of the tree line and stood 20 feet away in the dark, and Roman could see the outline of him, the specific set of his shoulders, the way he stood. 9 years of familiarity making the shape of him readable even in low light. Roman said, "Come here." Vincent came. He stopped 8 feet away, and he looked at Roman, and his face was doing the thing that Roman had seen faces do when people had been carrying something for a long time and had finally arrived at the place where they were going to put it down, whether they wanted to or not. "He told you I knew," Vincent said. Not a question. "Yes." "How long have you known?" "Since he named you, 40 minutes ago." Vincent looked at the ground, then back up. "It wasn't I wasn't against you, Roman. I want you to know that. I didn't. Stop, Roman said. Vincent stopped. What did he have on you? Roman said. A pause. The lake was audible from here, the low, consistent sound of water that didn't care about anything. Vincent's jaw moved. My son. My son has a problem, gambling, the kind of debt that doesn't stay in the room where it was made. Donato owned the debt. He came to me 22 months ago, and he told me that the debt would be resolved and my son would be protected, and all I had to do was keep him informed. Roman looked at him. I never compromised an operation, Vincent said. His voice had a quality in it. Not desperation exactly, something raw. The sound of a man making a true statement about himself that doesn't change what the true statement cost. I gave him movements, schedules. I gave him enough to stay ahead of you, but I never... The men tonight, at Meridian. That was real. I ran that operation clean. I let you get the children out clean. You told him the deployment timeline, Roman said. He left 10 minutes before we arrived. Yes. If he'd been a different kind of man, Roman said, if his plan had required the children to not be found, your deployment information would have been the thing that got them killed. Vincent said nothing. The thing that was happening on his face was not something Roman had a name for, and he didn't try to name it. Give me your weapon, Roman said. Vincent reached slowly into his jacket and produced the weapon and held it out. Roman took it. He held both weapons now, and he looked at the man who had sat 6 inches from him for 9 years, and he thought about the weight of that, and what it was worth, and what it wasn't. Your son's debt is cleared, Roman said. I'll handle it tonight. Whatever Donato held, it's gone. Vincent stared at him. And you're done, Roman said. Not dead. Done. You walk away from this and you don't come back and you don't contact anyone in the network and you take your son somewhere that isn't Chicago and you make a different life. That's what I'm giving you. Roman, don't, Roman said. Don't say anything that requires me to respond to it. Just go. Vincent stood there for one more moment. Then he nodded, once, and he turned and he walked back into the tree line, and Roman listened to his footsteps until they were gone, and then he stood alone in front of the dark house with the lake behind it, and the weight of the evening settling into his muscles and bones, the way exhaustion settled when you finally allowed it in. He took out his phone and called Elena. It's done, he said when she answered. Where are you? She gave him an address on the northwest side. He started moving. The apartment building was 4 stories and anonymous, the kind of building that existed in thousands of versions across thousands of cities, designed to be lived in without being noticed. Elena met him at the street door and looked at him in the light from the entrance, all of him, the whole picture, the coat and the exhaustion and whatever his face was doing. And she said nothing for a moment, just looked. Then she said, Are you hurt? No. You look like you're hurt. I'm not. She held the door and he went in and up 2 flights and into an apartment that was clean and small and smelled like instant coffee and had 3 children asleep on a pulled-out sofa bed in the main room, arranged in the specific unconscious geometry of siblings who had been falling asleep beside each other their entire lives. Roman stood in the doorway of that room and looked at them. Luca was in the center, on his back, one arm thrown out. Mara was curled on her side facing away. Sophia was on her back like Luca, but her face in sleep had lost the careful assessment it carried when she was awake, and what was left underneath it was just a child's face, 7 years old, ordinary, and complete. He stood there longer than he meant to. Elena came and stood beside him, and they looked at the 3 of them together, and the silence between Roman and Elena in that moment was the most honest thing that had happened between them in 6 years, maybe longer. Donato, Elena said quietly, gone. He'll stay gone. The documentation with Webb makes sure of that. The organization. It's going to need to be addressed, Roman said. 14 people compromised at operational levels. The financial structure has been running parallel instruments for 4 years. There's a lot that needs to be unwound. Elena said, Unwound how? Roman looked at the children, at Luca's thrown-out arm, at Sophia's sleeping face. I've been thinking about that since I left the house. And There's only one way to unwind it that doesn't just create the next version of the same problem, Roman said. The organization doesn't get reformed. It gets closed. He paused. Properly closed. Everything that can be documented, and turned over. The financial instruments, the operational records, the network structures. Webb already has Donato's file. If I come to him with the full picture, he can close the investigation that's been building for 4 years, and I can negotiate the terms of my own exit in a way that's... He stopped. That lets me be somewhere other than a cell. Elena was looking at him. He could feel it without turning. You're talking about turning federal witness, she said. I'm talking about ending it, Roman said. All of it, the whole thing. I'm talking about not handing this to someone else to run and watching the same machine keep moving with a different driver. He turned to look at her. I'm talking about what it would take for those 3 children to have a father who isn't a liability to them every single day of their lives. Elena held his gaze. Her face was doing something careful and complex, and she wasn't trying to hide it, which was different from the Elena he remembered from before. She had learned, apparently, to let the complexity show. She said, "That would cost you everything." I know what it would cost. The money, the properties, the network. I know. People in your position who cooperate with federal investigations don't always come out the other side, Elena said. Even when the deal is clean, there are people who don't accept the deal as the end of it. I know that too, Roman said. She was quiet for a moment, then, why? He looked back at the children. Because Donato was right about one thing. He said I had always been rational in service of something else, not the organization. He meant it as a criticism. He thought the something else was a weakness. Roman paused. He was wrong about what the something else was. He thought it was sentiment. It was never sentiment, it was this. He gestured slightly toward the room, toward the 3 sleeping children, toward the woman standing beside him. It was always this. I just spent 15 years building the wrong thing around it. Elena said nothing. But she didn't move away either, and in the small apartment on the northwest side of Chicago, that was the most that could be asked for. I need to make calls tonight, Roman said. I need to start the process before anyone in the network understands what Donato's exit means and tries to fill the vacuum. If I'm going to do this, I need to do it before morning. Then do it, Elena said. He nodded. He turned from the doorway and went to the kitchen table and sat down and opened his phone and began making the calls that would dismantle the thing he had spent 15 years building, one thread at a time, in the kitchen of a small apartment where 3 children he had known for less than 48 hours were sleeping in the next room. It took most of the night. Marcus Webb picked up on the second ring at 2:17 in the morning, which told Roman something about the state of Webb's evening since receiving Elena's drive. DeLuca, Webb said. His voice was alert in a way that said he hadn't been sleeping. You've reviewed what Elena sent, Roman said. I've reviewed enough of it to understand what it is, Webb said. I want to be careful about how I characterize what I have or haven't done with it until I understand what this call is. This call, Roman said, is me telling you that what Elena sent is the beginning of a larger picture and that I'm prepared to provide the rest of it in exchange for a structured agreement. He paused. I want to close this. The whole thing. Clean. A silence on Webb's end. Not surprise exactly. The silence of a man recalibrating around an outcome he had considered possible but not probable. How comprehensive are we talking? Webb said. Comprehensive enough that you can close the 4-year investigation and bring charges against 14 individuals at operational levels and present your office with the most complete picture of organized criminal infrastructure in the Northern District in the past decade, Roman said. In exchange for an agreement that keeps me out of a federal facility and allows me to relocate with my family. Your family, Webb said. Elena Cross. And our children. Another silence. She didn't mention children when she contacted me. She was protecting them, Roman said. She's been protecting them for 7 years. It's what she does. He let that sit. I know what I'm asking for is significant. I know the agreement I'm describing is not something that gets constructed easily. I'm not asking for it tonight. I'm telling you tonight that it's what I'm offering, and I need to know whether it's worth your office's time to sit down. Webb said, "It's worth sitting down." A pause. "Tomorrow, my office, 9 a.m. Come with a lawyer, DeLuca. Come with a good one." "I will," Roman said. He ended the call and set the phone on the table and sat in the kitchen of the small apartment and listened to the quiet. From the main room came the sound of children breathing in sleep, which was a sound he had not known for the first 7 years of his children's lives, and which was doing something to the inside of his chest that he still didn't have a word for. Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had a cup of something, the instant coffee, probably, and she looked at him across the small kitchen and said, "Webb, 9 a.m. tomorrow. He'll sit down." She nodded. She came and sat across from him at the table, and the table was small enough that they were closer than they had been since the coffee shop in Pilsen, and the kitchen light was the harsh overhead kind that showed everything, and they sat in it together and neither of them looked away. "This isn't forgiveness," Elena said. "I want you to understand that. Tonight isn't... What happened between us isn't resolved because of what happened tonight." "I know," Roman said. "You were gone for 7 years," she said. "You didn't know they existed, and that's different from choosing to be absent. But the result was the same, and the result is what they lived." "I know." "Luca has nightmares," Elena said. "He's had them since he was 4. He doesn't talk about them. He just wakes up and sits at the edge of the bed until they pass, and then he goes back to sleep. He never asked for anyone. He learned not to ask." Her voice was level, but the levelness was costing her something. "That's what 7 years of hiding did to my son. That's what was made." Roman said, "I know I can't undo it." "No," Elena said, "you can't." "I can be present for whatever comes after it," he said, "if you let me. That's all I'm telling you I can offer. Not the undoing, just the after." Elena looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen light was harsh and honest, and she sat in it without flinching, and he did too, and after a while she wrapped both hands around her cup and looked down at the table and said, "Go to sleep, Roman. You have a meeting at 9. It wasn't yes. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the thing that came before those things. The decision to remain in the same room with the possibility of them. Roman understood this and did not push past it. He found the couch in the side room and lay down in his clothes and was asleep in minutes because his body had reached its limit, and his body, unlike his mind, did not negotiate with limits. He did not know that at that moment, in a building across the city, one of the 14 names on Donato's list, a man named Carson Reed, who ran the West Side distribution network and who had been in Donato's structure for 3 years and who was not a man who waited for situations to develop around him, was sitting at his own table with his own phone and making his own calculations. Reed had received word of Donato's exit 2 hours ago through a channel that was supposed to be secure and had proven not to be. He had also received, through a separate channel, a fragmented piece of information that was more dangerous than Donato's exit, that Roman DeLuca had spent most of the night on the phone, and that one of those calls had been to a number associated with a federal prosecutor's office. Carson Reed was 44 years old and had survived in the criminal infrastructure of Chicago's West Side for 19 years by making decisions before the situation fully clarified, rather than after. He was not a man who waited to see how things resolved. He was a man who resolved things himself, preemptively, before the resolution was taken out of his hands. He made 3 calls in quick succession, and then he put on his jacket and he went out into the pre-dawn dark of the city, and the city received him the way it always did, indifferently, without comment, and he moved through it toward the northwest side with the particular focus of a man who has identified a problem and identified its location and is now simply closing the distance between himself and it. He did not know the exact address, but he had people who could find an address when the parameters were right, and the parameters were right, and by 4:30 in the morning he was parked 1 block south of the building on the northwest side, and 2 of his 3 calls had produced results, and the results were standing on the sidewalk in the pre-dawn cold, waiting for him to arrive. He stepped out of the car into the cold and looked up at the building. 4 stories, anonymous, the kind of building that tried not to be noticed. And he looked at the 2 men who had come when he called, and he said, "Third floor." One of his men said, "We don't have a unit number." "Then we start at one end and work to the other," Reed said, "until we find them." He started toward the entrance of the building, and behind him his 2 men fell into step. And above them in the building, Roman DeLuca was asleep on a couch, and Elena Cross was asleep in a chair, and 3 children were asleep on a pulled-out sofa bed. And none of them knew that the night was not finished yet, and the last bill of 15 years of a particular kind of living was coming due right now, in the dark, on the sidewalk of a building that was supposed to be safe because no one was supposed to know they were there. Roman came awake the way he always came awake when something was wrong. Not gradually, not with the slow surfacing of normal sleep, but all at once, every system online simultaneously, the body's alarm running faster than conscious thought. He was off the couch before he knew what had woken him. The apartment was still dark. The clock on the microwave in the kitchen said 4:47. He stood in the small side room and listened to the building around him and heard what had pulled him up. Footsteps in the stairwell. Not one person. Multiple. Moving with the careful deliberateness of people trying to be quiet, which produced its own particular sound. The sound of effort applied to silence, which was different from actual silence, and which he had learned to distinguish a long time ago in rooms very different from this one. He moved to the kitchen doorway and looked at Elena. She was already awake in the chair, already sitting forward, already listening. Her eyes found his in the low light and said what his said. "Someone is in the stairwell." He crossed to her in 4 steps and put his mouth close to her ear. "Take the children to the bathroom. Lock the door. Don't open it for anything except my voice." She didn't argue. She was up and into the main room before he finished the sentence, and he heard her very quietly, waking the children, the low specific murmur of a mother who had spent 7 years waking children in situations that required silence, and the small shuffling sounds of 3 kids moving while still mostly asleep, and then the bathroom door and the soft click of the lock. Roman had 2 weapons. Donato's men had left him with his own, and he had taken Vincent's in the garden. He checked both in the dark by feel, full, ready, and then he moved to the apartment door and stood beside it, not in front of it, and waited. The footsteps stopped on the landing outside. A voice, low. "Which unit?" Another voice. "Has to be one of 3. This end of the floor." "Reed." Roman didn't recognize the voice directly, but he recognized the operational method, narrowing the field rather than having the address exactly, which meant this approach had been assembled quickly and imperfectly, which meant Reed had moved fast when he got the information rather than taking time to get the information complete. That was consistent with what Roman knew of Reed, a man who preferred speed over precision, who had survived 19 years in the West Side not by being careful but by being first. The calculation was immediate. 3 apartments on this end of the floor. They would start at one end and work toward the other. If this apartment was the last one they tried, Roman had 2 minutes. If it was the first, he had seconds. He heard a knock on the apartment 2 doors down. Quiet. The knock of someone who was trying to wake people without waking the building. Second apartment. He had maybe 90 seconds. He looked at the door in the dark and thought about the shape of the landing outside it. He had come in through it hours ago, had registered it automatically. A landing with a railing, the stairwell descending to the left, a window at the far end that would be dark at this hour. 2 men with Reed, probably. Reed himself making 3. 3 armed men on a landing against 1 man in a doorway. The math was not good, but the math of staying in the apartment and letting them come through the door was worse, because in the apartment there were 3 children and their mother in a locked bathroom, which meant the only tactical option from inside was to hold the bathroom door against men who would understand immediately what was behind it and would use that understanding. The doorway was better. The doorway was a choke point that reduced 3 against 1 to something closer to sequential rather than simultaneous. He heard them move to the next door. 1 apartment between him and them. He moved his hand to the deadbolt, turned it slowly. The mechanism was old and had some resistance, and he worked it with care, getting it fully retracted without sound. And then he had his hand on the knob, and he waited and he counted his own heartbeat because his heartbeat had always been the most reliable clock he had. The knock on the adjacent apartment came and went without response. Footsteps on the hall floor, moving toward his door. Roman opened the door and went through it. The landing was dark, except for a security light at the far end that gave everything a yellowish undercast.
3 men. 2 he didn't know. One he recognized from the organizational structure as a Reed associate named Briggs, and Reed himself at the back of the group, slightly taller than the other 2, wearing a dark coat, with the expression of a man executing a plan. The 2 in front had weapons half raised. The half-raised position was the error. It was the position of men who expected to be knocking on a door, not of men expecting the door to open toward them. The adjustment from half-raised to fired required a beat, and Roman was inside that beat before either of them finished making it. He went left and low, and the first weapon discharged into the doorframe above where his head had been, and the sound of it in the enclosed landing was enormous. A physical thing, a pressure that hit the ears and the chest simultaneously. And Roman came up inside the first man's reach, and the encounter was brief and physical, and when it was finished, the first man was on the floor, and Roman had moved to the second. Briggs was fast. He was faster than Roman expected and got a hand on Roman's weapon arm, and they went into the railing together, and the railing held, but the impact drove the breath out of Roman, and for 2 seconds the world was just the effort of not going over it while Briggs tried to redirect the weapon toward him. Roman let go of the weapon. Briggs didn't expect that. The sudden release of resistance pulled him forward, and Roman used the fraction of a second that Briggs needed to adjust, and he hit him twice in quick succession, and Briggs went sideways into the wall and slid down it, and Roman took the weapon back from a hand that was no longer gripping it and turned. Reed had not moved during any of this. He was standing at the back of the landing with his own weapon raised and leveled, and he had deliberately waited, while his 2 men engaged, and the waiting had given him a clean shot at Roman that the engagement of the other 2 had prevented him from taking. And now the engagement was over, and the clean shot existed. Roman stood on the landing with blood on his hand from somewhere, and his breath coming hard, and Reed's weapon pointed at him from 12 feet away, and he looked at Carson. Reed looked at him, and the landing was quiet, except for their breathing, and the distant sound of the city going about its 4:47 a.m. business below them. "Donato called me," Reed said. His voice was level, not angry. The voice of a man who had made a business assessment and was executing it. "He said you were going to Webb. He said you had everything and you were going to give it to them." "Donato's gone," Roman said. "I know he's gone. That's why I'm here instead of him." Reed's weapon didn't move. 14 names on that list, Roman. My name is on that list. 14 people whose lives end if you walk into Webb's office at 9 a.m. with whatever you've compiled. Your lives as they currently exist, Roman said, not your actual lives. For some of us, that's the same thing. Roman's breathing was evening. The impact with the railing had done something to his left side, a deep bruising ache that was going to be significant in an hour, but was currently running below the threshold of functional interference. He kept it below that threshold by not attending to it. "What do you want, Carson?" "I want you to not walk into Webb's office," Reed said. "I want whatever you've compiled to disappear. And I want the organization to continue operating without you, under a structure that doesn't require anyone to go to federal prosecutors to exit cleanly. And if I say no," Reed looked at him, "then this ends here on this landing and the organization continues without you in a different way." Roman said, "The documentation is already with Webb. What Elena sent him last night. My call with him at 2 a.m. is logged. If I don't walk into that office at 9, the logged call becomes the starting point for an investigation without my cooperation, which produces worse outcomes for every name on that list than a structured agreement." Reed's jaw moved. Recalculating. "You're bluffing." "I've never bluffed in my life," Roman said. "Ask anyone who's sat across a table from me. It's the one thing people consistently say. Roman DeLuca does not bluff." A pause. The security light at the end of the landing hummed its faint electrical hum. Briggs had stopped moving against the wall. The first man on the floor was breathing but not engaged. The landing smelled like concrete and the discharged weapon and something metallic that Roman recognized as his own blood from a cut on his palm he hadn't noticed making. "If you cooperate with Webb," Reed said, "where does that leave the people on that list?" "Some of them will be charged," Roman said. "I can't change that, and I won't try. The people who built real exposure over real time, that's not something a cooperation agreement can erase, and I won't insult you by suggesting it." He paused. "But some of them are people Donato compromised, people who were in his structure because he had instruments against them, not because they chose it. Those people have a different situation. That's something a cooperation agreement can address." "Which category am I in?" "You called 3 people at 2 in the morning and came to this building with weapons," Roman said. "You're not in the compromised category, Carson. You know that." Reed looked at him. Something moved through the look. Not defeat, not exactly. The look of a man arriving at the place where the options he had believed he had are revealed to not be the options, and what remains is just the actual situation, stripped of the versions of it that were more comfortable. Reed's weapon arm lowered. Not all the way. Halfway. The posture of a man who hadn't fully decided but was no longer actively deciding to fire. "There's a version of this," Roman said carefully, "where you walk out of this building and you get a lawyer and you make your own contact with Webb's office before 9 a.m. and you come to the table before the table comes to you. That's a different conversation than the one that happens if you're named in my cooperation filing without having made any prior contact." He held Reed's eyes. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what the geometry of the next 4 hours looks like." Reed stood with the half-lowered weapon and the look of a man doing the geometry. Then he put the weapon in his jacket. He looked at Roman for one more moment, the look of a man burning something into memory, whether as a record of what had happened or as something else Roman couldn't read. And then he stepped around the man on the floor and went to the stairwell and went down it, and his footsteps faded, and the landing was quiet. Roman stood in the yellow security light and let his left side start to exist fully and winced at what it had to say. He looked at the 2 men on the landing and made 2 calls. One to a private medical contact, one to a cleanup service he had used for exactly this kind of situation, and gave the address and the floor and said, "Non-fatal, 2 individuals, landing, I need it resolved before the building wakes up." And the people on the other ends of both calls said what they always said, "Understood." He went back to the apartment door. He knocked twice, paused, knocked once. Elena's code. He had given it to her in the kitchen before he went out. A simple sequence she could recognize. He heard the bathroom door unlock, and then the apartment door, and Elena opened it and looked at him in the way she had looked at him on the landing in Pilsen. All of him, the whole picture. And her face did something that she allowed it to do this time without controlling it. He was bleeding from his hand, and his left side was going to be a problem for several days, and he was standing in a hallway in a northwest side apartment building at 5 in the morning, and he was, by any available measure, intact. "It's over," he said. She stepped back and let him in. Marcus Webb was a compact man in his mid-50s who wore the expression of someone who had spent 20 years looking at the worst available evidence about human behavior and had arrived at a kind of professional equanimity about it that was not quite cynicism, but was adjacent to it. He had been in his office at 8:45 when Roman arrived with a lawyer named Diane Cho, who had the reputation of being the best federal negotiator in Chicago, and who charged accordingly, and who Roman had called at 6 in the morning, and who had said, without surprise, "I'll be there." The meeting lasted 4 hours. Roman had expected it to be adversarial, and it was, but it was adversarial in the specific way of 2 professionals who understood what each of them needed from the transaction and were working toward a structure that provided it. Webb wanted the organization closed and documented. Roman wanted his family out of the geographic and legal blast radius of the closing. Diane Cho wanted the agreement to survive appellate scrutiny. These 3 objectives were not incompatible, which made the 4 hours difficult but not impossible. Carson Reed's lawyer arrived at Webb's office at 10:15 while Roman was still in the meeting. Webb took a 15-minute break to receive the preliminary contact and came back into the room with the expression of a man who had just received a variable that simplified his calculation. "Your West Side distributor," Webb said. I know, Roman said. He's making his own arrangement. I expected he would, Roman said. He's a practical man. That's always been his main characteristic. Webb looked at him for a moment. The 14 names on the list, Reed makes one. The documentation you provided identifies the others. Of those, 4 are individuals who appear to have been compromised rather than recruited. Donato had instruments against them. We'll treat those 4 differently. That's what I asked for, Roman said. You asked for it. I'm telling you that the evidence supports it, which is different. Webb folded his hands on the table. The agreement we're building protects you and your family from prosecution related to the organization's activities during your tenure. It requires your full cooperation with the investigation and ongoing availability as a witness in any resulting prosecutions. It requires surrender of all assets held through organizational structures. And it requires relocation, you and your family, outside Illinois, under a framework that my office will coordinate. Diane Cho said, we'll need specifics on the relocation framework before... We'll provide specifics, Webb said. He looked at Roman. There's one more thing. Roman waited. Donato Ferry, Webb said. He left Chicago last night. We have his travel. He's currently in a city that has an extradition agreement with the United States. The documentation Elena Cross provided, combined with what you've given us this morning, is sufficient to support an international warrant. A pause. He'll be brought back. Roman said, Good. Webb looked at him steadily. I've been building a file on your organization for 4 years, DeLuca. I want you to understand that this agreement is not something I arrive at lightly. The cooperation you're providing has to be complete. If I find anything withheld, the agreement dissolves. It'll be complete, Roman said. Then we have the basis of a negotiation. Webb stood and extended his hand across the table. Roman looked at the hand and then he shook it, and the handshake was brief and professional and had in it the particular quality of an ending. Not a comfortable ending, not a clean one, but an ending nonetheless. The asset surrender took 6 weeks to complete. It was, in Roman's experience, the most comprehensive dismantling of a constructed life that he had ever witnessed from the inside, which was a strange experience. Like watching a building you had built being taken apart by people who had studied the blueprints and understood exactly how it had been assembled. Properties, financial instruments, vehicles, accounts held through layers of corporate structure, all of it itemized, transferred, dissolved. The organization that had taken 15 years to build required 6 weeks to document and close. He was present for most of it. Present and functioning, because functioning was what the agreement required, and Roman was a man who honored the agreements he made. But present also in a different sense, attending to the dismantling with the attention of someone who was making sure it was done right, who did not want this to be done halfway or sloppy and leave residual infrastructure that someone else could use later. He did it right. He did it completely. During those 6 weeks, he lived in a hotel on the north side with Elena and the children in adjacent rooms, an arrangement that was functional and careful, and had the texture of people learning to be in proximity after a long absence. The children adapted with the flexibility of children, which was sometimes easier to watch than Elena's more deliberate adult management of the situation. Mara and Sophia found the hotel interesting. Luca was watchful, but not unhappy. He was always watchful, always running the calculation. Roman recognized this because he ran the same calculation, and seeing it in the face of a 7-year-old was the most uncomfortable form of self-recognition he had ever experienced. One evening in the 3rd week, Luca came and sat across from Roman at the small table in Roman's room where Roman was reviewing documents. Luca sat down without asking and put his elbows on the table and looked at Roman with the direct assessment that was his characteristic mode. Roman put the documents down. "What?" he said. Luca said, "Are you scared?" Roman considered the question with the seriousness it deserved rather than the deflection it would have been easy to offer. "Of what specifically?" "Of it not working," Luca said. "All of this. All the stuff you're doing. What if you do all of it and it still doesn't work?" Roman looked at his son. The word still arrived with a slight physical quality, a weight in the chest every time he formed it. And he said, "Then it doesn't work, and we figure out what comes after that." "That's not a real answer." "It's the only real one, Tick," Roman said. "The version where I promise you it all works out is a comfortable answer. It's not an honest one." Luca considered this. He had his mother's way of processing, visible, unhurried, not performing the thinking but actually doing it. Mom says you're different from what she expected. What did she expect? She expected you to try to take over, to make everything about what you wanted. He paused. She said you haven't done that. Roman said, I've done enough taking over for one life. Luca looked at him for another moment. Then he got up from the table and went back to the adjacent room without any further ceremony, and Roman sat with the documents and the empty chair and the particular quiet of a man who had said a true thing to his child and felt the specific weight of its being received. The relocation was to a mid-sized city on the Oregon coast, chosen by Webb's office for reasons of distance and anonymity and the absence of any pre-existing organizational connection. A house near the water, under names that were legally theirs but publicly unremarkable, in a neighborhood of unremarkable houses where people worked ordinary jobs and had ordinary lives and were not interested in their neighbors' histories. Roman stood in the empty house the first afternoon before the furniture arrived and walked through the rooms the way you walked through a space you were learning. Hardwood floors. A kitchen with a window that looked out at a back garden that had nothing growing in it. Rooms that were clean and neutral and had no history in them. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the empty garden. Elena came and stood beside him. They had been doing this more, finding themselves in the same room, standing near each other without the event of it being a decision, which was different from before. Not resolution, not forgiveness, which she had said clearly was not a thing that arrived on a schedule, but proximity. The choosing of proximity, incrementally, carefully, the way you chose to put weight on something you weren't sure would hold. It needs something, Elena said, looking at the garden. Roman said, probably. She looked at him sideways. A small thing happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape that a smile made when the muscles hadn't committed yet. You could plant something. I don't know anything about plants. I know, she said. I could show you. He looked at the garden. At the bare November ground, the Oregon sky above it, the particular quality of light near the coast that was different from Chicago's light, softer, more diffused, without the hard urban edge that he had breathed his entire adult life. Okay, he said. The prosecutions that emerged from Roman's cooperation took 2 years to work through the federal system. Of the 14 names on Donato's list, 9 resulted in charges and eventual convictions. The 4 individuals who had been compromised rather than recruited received arrangements that kept them out of federal facilities. Carson Reed's cooperation, which had been first contact and therefore carried weight, produced a sentence that was real but navigable. Donato Ferry was extradited 4 months after leaving Chicago. His trial, when it came, was built substantially on the documentation Elena had compiled and sent to Marcus Webb on an October evening in a Pilsen coffee shop. The fabrication of evidence, the conspiracy, the organizational manipulation that had dismantled a marriage and hidden 3 children from their father for 7 years, all of it documented, all of it presented, all of it placed on record. The verdict when it came was not something Roman celebrated. He was sitting in the garden when Elena came out and told him, and he sat with it for a while and felt the complicated texture of it. Not satisfaction exactly, not relief exactly, something more ambivalent and more honest than either of those things. Something that acknowledged that the verdict didn't restore the 7 years and didn't unburn what had burned and was not, in any simple sense, enough, but was the closest available approximation of the thing that justice pointed at without fully being. He said, "Okay." Elena sat down beside him in the garden, in the Oregon afternoon light. The climbing thing she had planted against the back wall in October was dormant now, waiting for spring with the patience that things had when they didn't know time was passing. She had bought it at a nursery on the edge of town and planted it on a Saturday afternoon while the children watched and asked questions about what it would look like when it grew, and Roman had stood at the kitchen window and watched all 4 of them in the garden, and had not been able to fully identify what was happening in his chest except that it was large and without much precedent. "The kids have school tomorrow," Elena said. "I know. Luca has a project due. He hasn't finished it." "I know. He was working on it last night." Elena looked at him. "You checked on him." "He had the light on at 11, Roman said. "I knocked. He let me in." A pause.
We worked on it together for an hour. He wouldn't let me do any of it. He was very specific about that. He just wanted someone to sit there while he worked. Elena was quiet for a moment. He does that with me sometimes, she said. He doesn't want help. He just wants the company. I know, Roman said. He told me. The garden was quiet. The light was going the way Oregon light went in the late afternoon. Slowly, without drama, folding itself into the water somewhere west of them. The climbing thing on the wall was just a structure of dry stems at this point, intricate and bare, waiting for what came next with no particular urgency. Sophia came to the back door and looked out at them. She had a book in one hand and the assessing expression that she always had, the one that Roman had stopped finding unsettling and had started finding simply characteristic, the specific way his daughter looked at the world. Dinner, she said. Who's cooking? Elena said. Mara started it. A pause. She says it's fine, but there's a smell. Elena stood. Go tell her to turn the heat down. Sophia disappeared back inside. Elena looked at Roman. Come in. In a minute, he said. She went inside. He sat in the garden alone for another minute, in the Oregon October evening, in the quiet of a life that was entirely different from the life he had built and lost and dismantled. And he thought about 15 years and about what they had produced and what they had cost and whether the accounting of it could ever come out to anything that resembled sense. He didn't think it could. He thought some costs were just costs, not lessons, not investments, not material for a better understanding. He thought the 7 years his children had spent without a father were just 7 years that were gone and would not be recovered by anything he did afterward. He thought Elena's 6 years of running and hiding were just 6 years, and the garden she had planted in the North Shore house that had grown untended for 6 years while she was somewhere else was just a thing that had grown without her. And the fact that it had grown didn't mean anything except that things grew when they had ground and water. But he was here now, in the ground and water sense, present in the place where things either grew or they didn't. He got up from the chair and went inside. The kitchen smelled like something Mara had in fact burned slightly on one side, and Mara was defending the decision with the specific energy of a child who knew she was wrong but was not prepared to concede it. And Elena was at the stove making the adjustments that would salvage the situation with the efficient calm of a woman who had been salvaging situations for a long time. And Luca was setting the table with his particular focused economy, and Sophia was back in her chair with her book, reading with the complete absorption that was her characteristic mode when the household noise rose above a certain threshold. Roman stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of it. Then he went to the drawer where the plates were kept and started taking them out to help Luca set the table. And Luca looked at him and didn't say anything, and Roman didn't say anything, and they set the table together in the warm kitchen of the Oregon house, while outside the garden waited in the dark for whatever spring would bring to it. There was no clean ending to the story of Roman DeLuca and Elena Cross, and the 3 children who had stepped in front of his convoy on a rainy October evening in downtown Chicago. Clean endings were for people whose costs had been paid by someone else. What existed instead was this: a table being set, a meal being salvaged, a woman at a stove, a girl reading, a boy who woke from nightmares and sat at the edge of the bed until they passed. Doing it now, sometimes, with his father in the chair beside him, both of them sitting in the dark without speaking until the dark was just the dark again and sleep was possible. This was not redemption in any grand sense. It was smaller than that and more durable. It was the daily work of a man who had finally understood what he was actually building, arriving too late to build it from the beginning and building it from here instead. From this kitchen, from this table, from this ordinary salvaged dinner in a house near the water where nobody knew his name or his history, and the garden in the back was waiting, with the patience of growing things, for someone to tend it in the spring. He set the last plate down and pulled out his chair and sat, and across the table Mara was still defending her cooking with diminishing conviction, and Sophia had put the book away, and Luca was looking at the slightly burned food with the expression of a boy calculating whether to comment, and Elena caught Roman's eye across the table with a look that was not forgiveness and not love, not yet those things in their full form, but was something that preceded them and was necessary to them. The look of 2 people who have survived the worst version of themselves and are choosing, today, to sit at the same table. Roman DeLuca looked back at her. Outside, the Pacific moved its cold, vast movement against the Oregon coast, indifferent and immense, the way water always was. And inside, someone passed the bread, and someone argued about the food, and someone read under the table thinking no one noticed. And the man who had once ruled through fear sat at a dinner table in an ordinary house and understood, with the particular clarity of a person who has lost everything and found the one thing he was actually looking for, that this ordinary, imperfect, slightly burned dinner in a house where nobody knew his name was the only victory that had ever been worth fighting for.